we get to start talking about connective tissues now. And conveniently, when we talk about connective tissues, their job is, in a nutshell, to connect. So let's delve in. Just the way epithelial tissue has common characteristics, connective tissue does also. All of the connective tissues about which we learn and speak have a current origin, which is what's known as mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is a very loosely organized connective tissue that's going to be found in the embryo and will give rise to every single connective tissue cell. It's sort of this loosely packed, unspecialized cluster or group of cells that is going to be set in a gel-like matrix. So again, every single type of connective tissue arises from mesenchyme, as does the circulatory and lymphatic systems. This is just a nice to know, not a need to know, but this is showing you how mesenchyme develops within the oral cavity and actually gives rise to teeth, which is pretty cool. When we talk about the general characteristics of connective tissue, you need to know that there are going to be structural elements which include connective tissue cells themselves, and then what is known as intercellular matrix, which is basically this stuff around the cells. If you think back to the epithelial tissues that we talked about, epithelial tissue has very tightly packed cells. There's not a lot of stuff in between those cells, if anything. Connective tissue is different because that intercellular matrix is going to be what's known as ground substance and fibers, which will surround the cells. And this will make sense as we continue through this portion. Also different from epithelial tissue, which you'll recall is entirely avascular, when you talk about connective tissue, there's going to be a spectrum of vascularity, which ranges from cartilage, which is avascular. So if you ever had a cartilage injury, if you've had a damaged articular cartilage or what have you, it takes a long time to heal because everything that moves in and out has to go in and out through diffusion or osmosis. Bone, on the other hand, heals very quickly because it is highly vascular, very well endowed with blood vessels. And blood, this is probably the most vascular of all of the connective tissues because it has that very atypical liquid matrix plasma, and the red blood cells are actually carrying oxygen around. What are their functions when you talk about connective tissue? Well, let's think about it. It does establish a framework and structure for the body because the skeleton, bone, is going to be part of the connective tissue family. Blood is within the connective tissue family. So yep, sure enough, it's going to transport fluids and dissolved materials all around the body, as well as gases. Adipose is going to store energy and help protect organs. So if you think about your kidneys or your eyes, there's a fairly heavy amount of adipose around both your kidneys and your eyes for protection. Connective tissues will also support and surround and interconnect other tissues. So we'll see that when we talk about loose areolar connective tissue, for example, and we'll also see that when we talk about dense regular connective tissue, which is going to form tendons and ligaments. And in addition, because we have white blood cells in blood, connective tissue actually helps us fight against invading pathogens and therefore is part of the immune system. Now, ground substance, I mentioned that before. What is it? So it's this stuff that is going to fill the spaces between cells and fibers, and it's sometimes sort of this gelatinous mass. And it's going to function sort of as a molecular sieve, which will allow some material through and not others. We do need to talk about the connective tissue fibers, and they are all pictured there, as are a number of the different types of cells that you're going to need to know. Collagen fibers, what a surprise, are composed of the protein collagen. Collagen has an enormously high tensile strength. Gram for gram, it is stronger than steel. What does that mean? It means it can take twisting and bending and shearing, an enormous amount of twisting and bending and shearing. And if you think about it, tendons are going to be made up of parallel bundles of collagen fibers. And if you think about how many times, say, you move your fingers in a day or you flex and extend your elbow, that is where the strength, that tensile strength of collagen comes into play, because you can do that innumerable times and nothing bad happens. Now, don't panic. We will not put images on an assessment and say, identify this type of fiber, but you should know that collagen is going to have a very, very high tensile strength. Elastic fibers are going to be composed of a protein which is conveniently known as elastin. What happens with elastic fibers? They can stretch and then go back to their original shape. Collagen is not elastic, it is strong. Elastic fibers are elastic, just like a rubber band is an elastic. So they help provide, these guys are going to help provide rubber resilience to the matrix. And where will they be found? Skin, lungs, and blood vessels. Think about that. If you pull your skin out, if you're doing that tenting exercise to see if you or your patient or whoever you're doing that on is dehydrated, those elastic fibers will not respond as quickly as they ordinarily were if you were hydrated. Lungs, it's going to be important to have a lot of elastic fibers in the lungs because they need to expand and contract with inspiration and expiration. I should say expiration and inspiration if we're talking about expanding and contracting. And blood vessels are going to need to have a fair number of elastic fibers because they will have to vasoconstrict and vasodilate depending on what's happening with how hard your heart is beating and what hormonal changes they might have to respond to. Reticular fibers are teensy, 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 teensy. They are going to be found in the basement of epithelial tissue. They are collagenous, but they are very, very, very thin. Look at the measurement up there. They're 10 microns. That's 10 microns. So these guys are going to be smaller than 10 microns. They form very delicate networks, but they're strong because they're made up of collagen. So sure enough, they will have tensile strength. When it comes to the connective tissue cells, there will be a fundamental cell type in each of the varying connective tissues. Anytime you see osteo, think bone. So cyte means mature cell. So osteocyte is a mature cell that is going to be surrounded by the matrix and bone. Chondro always means cartilage. Remember these prefixes and suffixes and roots of words because they will help you on any assessment, including boards. Chondro for cartilage, cyte for mature cell. So sure enough, you have chondrocytes that are going to be surrounded by the matrix of cartilage. And then we have fibroblasts in most of the other connective tissue. And we'll talk more about fibroblasts as we go through this section. Blast cells, when you hear blast, think baby cells. These are the cells that are laying down matrix. So they are oftentimes undifferentiated, but they can give rise, or they generally do give rise to certain types of tissue. Fibroblasts, we know, will be in many of the connective tissues. Osteoblasts are baby bone cells that are laying down matrix. Once the matrix is formed, blast cells morph into cytes, which are less active. So osteoblasts are baby bone cells, which will morph into osteocytes. Chondroblasts, again, chondro means cartilage, so chondroblasts will morph into chondrocytes. And then hemocytoblasts are going to be these giant cells that will, depending on how they're programmed to split, will change into any of the formed elements, depending on what genes are triggered. We also need to talk a little bit about white blood cells because these guys are going to migrate through the body and respond when you have a wound or tissue damage or are undergoing inflammation in certain areas. There are two major types. Macrophages are going to be the phagocytes. So they are going to basically come and lyse pathogens, dead cells, and they will also send out chemical messengers to mobilize body defenses. Mast cells are very small and quite mobile, and they are going to release histamine. What does histamine do? And they will also release heparin. And what does heparin do? We'll talk about those in class if somebody reminds me.